Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the first webinar of the Global Weather Enterprise Forum. My name is Vladimir Tsirkunov and I am the head of Hydromet program of the GFDRR, Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery of the World Bank. The title of today's event is A Vision for Numerical Weather Prediction in 2030. We have quite exciting agenda today, and not surprisingly, there are some 200 participants registered for this event. Now a few words about the order of this webinar. Main presenter is Professor Tim Palmer, and there will be three panelists or discussants: Alan Thorpe, Lars Riishojgaard, and Alice Soares. Let me now introduce our main presenter, Tim Palmer. Tim Palmer is a Royal Society Research Professor in Weather and Climate Physics in the Department of Physics at the University of Oxford. Prior to that, he worked at the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecast and at the UK Met Office, where he pioneered the development of ensemble weather and climate prediction. Broadly speaking, Tim's research covers areas of physics where nonlinearity is important. He coordinated and chaired a number of high-level programs and projects, was lead author, member of scoping committee, and review editor of IPCC reports. He has won the top prizes of the European and American Meteorological Societies, and in 2020 he was elected an international member of the US National Academy of Sciences. With that, Tim, floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's very nice to be talking to everyone, I guess, from around the world. Giving this talk is a little bit fortuitous for me because I have very recently written a paper for WMO about a vision for numerical weather prediction in 2030, which hopefully will be the basis of, or so at least some input into a white paper that WMO is writing on this topic. So these ideas are pretty much fresh in my mind. Now, a very basic question one could ask is, why bother, with any sort of vision for numerical weather prediction? Maybe we can just continue with some small increments every year, and we don't need any particularly bold vision. Numerical weather prediction is maybe already good enough for the purposes we want. So that's the first question I want to address. How far we are from where we would like to be in numerical weather prediction was very much brought home to me in a discussion we had in the Bureau of Meteorology workshop on ensemble forecasting about a year and a half ago, discussing the rather tragic floods in Kerala in 2018, which I think killed upwards of 600 people and certainly devastated the local economy, and where the warnings were pretty poor, I would say, and certainly warnings with not enough lead time to really allow local governments and so on to take major evacuation or flood defense action and so on. Now, one of the speakers at the workshop was speaking about the ECMWF ensemble prediction system, and how that at day 7 it had forecast a probability of a 2 sigma rainfall event for Kerala with a probability of about 30%. And the speaker was sort of quite pleased that there was such a signal in the forecast at that range. However, one of the participants in the workshop, who was from India himself, commented that a 2 sigma event would hardly be noticed in Kerala. We were talking here about a 15 sigma event. And of course, at that sort of intensity, that sort of extremity, the current numerical weather prediction system was completely incapable of predicting a signal at a range where major preemptive action could have been taken. So I think, whilst we can be proud of the achievements in numerical weather prediction, we have really a long way to go before we can seriously say we're able to predict these types of extreme events at a range, at a lead time, as I say, where local governments and aid agencies and others can take preemptive action, which really we're talking about at least a week ahead. So I think there are a number of reasons why one of the really key issues here is to continue the path that we've taken, but really accelerate it in trying to get the resolution of our global forecast models down to around 1 to 3 kilometers. Scientifically, this means that we're better able to represent the laws of physics. And, at the end of the day, this is a scientific enterprise. So being able to solve the equations of physics more accurately is a good thing from a scientific point of view. But there are also 3 very important practical reasons why we want to go to high resolution. The first is that it does, of course, lead to better representation and simulation of extremes. I think that is pretty obvious to anyone that's studied area models and so on. The second point, which I think is is not made so clearly, but is certainly true, is that it means we'll be able to assimilate observations much better. And a key paper in this regard was by a colleague of mine, Mark Rodwell, from the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, ECMWF, who showed that the cases where the ECMWF medium range forecast over Europe failed most dramatically were ones where upstream over the US, about 5 days earlier, the flow was very much dominated by organized mesoscale convection. And in that situation, the analysis, which was obviously done with the global model, was not really able to well assimilate the observations of this mesoscale convection for the very simple reason that the model could not resolve mesoscale convection. And so it did a poor job in assimilating the observations, which contained the information of the convection. And as a result, the errors from the initial conditions grew and ultimately led to very poor forecasts. So this is really a very key point. My own particular view is that if you want to improve the skill of medium range forecasts by improving the initial conditions, you're actually better off improving the resolution of the assimilating model than actually injecting new observations into the initial conditions. In Mark Rodwell's paper, he showed there were plentiful observations. There was no lack of observations in these situations where the forecasts were poor. It was because the model couldn't assimilate the observations, because the assimilating model didn't have the resolution. And then the third point is that once we go to these types of resolutions, some of the key parameterizations that are used in global models, such as deep convection and orographic gravity wave drag, and indeed in the oceans, the mesoscale mesoscale eddies that occur around the Gulf Stream and the Kuroshio, these will not need to be parameterized. They can instead be represented by the laws of physics. And we have pretty good evidence, I think, that if we can simulate these processes properly, rather than relying on very approximate and imprecise parameterizations, we'll reduce the systematic errors in the model. And systematic errors really start to become important after maybe a week or 10 days. And certainly once one gets out to say, seasonal or intraseasonal, seasonal or climate timescales, systematic errors are still a dominant error in our models. And the systematic errors on seasonal timescales are typically the same magnitude as the signals we want to try to predict from things like El Nino. Now, a crucial question when we come to this issue about 1 to 3 kilometers, and one I'm going to address in a second, is how many models do we need around the world at this sort of resolution? And I just want to make an important kind of conceptual point here, which is that when I talk about a model, I no longer think of a model as a piece of deterministic code, which models were maybe 20 or 30 years ago. These days, the top numerical weather prediction models, and increasingly a lot of climate models, try to contain within the code the inherent uncertainties in the process of truncating the partial differential equations and the parameterization of unresolved processes. And they do this by so-called stochastic representations. So when I talk about a model today, I really think, and I think people in general should think of it this way, they are pieces of code which attempt at least to, as best they can, to include the uncertainties, representations of the uncertainties, for example, in the parameterization processes through stochasticity. Now, that's really important in this question about how many models do we need, because if we wanted a multi-model ensemble to capture uncertainty, then we may need many, many such models. But if we can represent a lot of that a multi-model kind of diversity through stochasticity in a single model, then the number of models we need is going to be very, very much smaller. This is just a paper which appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the US National Academy of Science, written by myself and Bjorn Stevens, director of the Max Planck Institute in Germany, on how this type of resolution is needed not only for weather prediction, but for climate change. It's quite crucial for understanding better regional climate change. But I won't go into that aspect now. Okay, 2030 is 10 years away, but I think, you know, even if we set ourselves a challenge of a 1 to, say, 3 kilometer, that sort of range, ensemble by 2030, it will still be enormously challenging for, you know, for high performance computing resources, because it's not just a case of making a single high resolution forecast. It's making an ensemble. And I think there are good reasons which mean that we should not compromise on current ensemble size of around 50 members. And maybe there's a good case for actually having more than 50 members. But I also want to make another point that if we're being serious about using NWP for running impact models, we have to have a good prior knowledge of the skill of the products. If we're using these impact products for actual applications, it's absolutely vital we have prior knowledge of the likely skill and reliability, indeed, of these impact products. And that means that we have to make reforecasts. We have to, every time a new model is implemented, we have to go back and make reforecasts of that model over the past, maybe some decades, to get a good sample of forecasts for assessing skill. And this, incidentally, will also be important when we come to talk about calibrating and indeed downscaling the ensembles for really sort of ultra high resolution forecasts. There are some things which I would just say very quickly in passing that will help in reducing the HPC load of a high resolution model. One is actually the use of artificial intelligence methods for representing the parameterizations. This is something, you know, we're doing in my group in Oxford, and there are other groups around the world looking at this. And because parameterization can be expensive, and AI has a possibility of making the subgrid parameterizations much cheaper. We're also looking very carefully at the use of reduced precision modeling. A lot of AI now is based on GPUs which run at 16 or even 8-bit precision, very reduced precision. And we've found that, whereas of course the default in NWP for many decades has been double precision, 64-bit precision. We've shown that single precision is completely satisfactory, and there's a lot of, I think, evidence that we can, once we've got NWP onto GPUs, we can actually make considerable use of these half precision chips for a lot of the modeling. So that's going to help as well. There's also work towards using domain-specific languages for speeding up the computation. That will be important. But my own view is that, you know, this is a major computational challenge, and I think the way ECMWF, you know, was the philosophy of ECMWF is really the right one, that we need to pool our human and computing resources, at least on the continental scale, for creating these ultra high resolution global ensembles with the reforecasts that are needed for calibration and validation. So when coming back to the how many models, my own feeling is roughly, you know, 1 per continent is about right. And certainly in Europe, I think we have an overabundance of models at the moment. So that's an important, I think, issue for how do we how do we create the optimal forecast system for the benefit of society? And I think pooling human and computing resources on the continental scale is going to be important. Oh, this is just to, if anyone needs reminding why ensemble forecasting is important. These are just show the growth of small perturbations in the famous Lorentz model. And, you know, you could think of the one on the top left as being a very predictable situation, and the one in the top right as a kind of average situation. But from time to time, you're going to get situations where the growth, this is the bottom middle, the growth of uncertainty is explosive. And that can happen, you know, even in the short range. This explosive growth of uncertainty can happen in a matter of a day or two. So we have to have ensemble forecasts so that we can we know in advance when we're heading into a particularly unpredictable situation. I think, you know, my own view is deterministic prediction, no matter what scale it is fundamentally unscientific. And I think we have to just bite the bullet and say all predictions on all scales and all time scales have to be done in an ensemble probabilistic way. Basically showing 3 hurricanes or tropical cyclones. The first one is extremely predictable. The ensemble spread is small. The middle one was Katrina, where the spread was sort of medium. And the third one was an exceptionally unpredictable hurricane called Nadine. It's just really illustrative. And I just wanted to make the point that I think there's some very exciting developments in the impact field. And this is a particular one that the International Red Cross Red Crescent is pushing, called forecast-based financing, where we try to take proactive action ahead of extreme weather events in the sense of sending financing to the regions that are predicted to be affected by severe weather. But, you know, for this to really make sense, it has to be based on probabilistic triggers, and these probabilities have to be reliable and trustworthy, and that needs a very sophisticated and advanced prediction system. So that kind of brings me to the next point, which I realize is for some probably in the who are tuned in is going to be extremely controversial. But clearly an ensemble with a resolution of 1 to 3 kilometers is not getting down to postcode scales. So how do we get really down to the postcode scale? And, you know, traditionally we've used limited area models, or National Met Services have used limited area models, maybe, you know, driven by the global boundary conditions from the global model. I think there's some major problems with this type of idea moving forward. What we really want to do is use, you know, these types of, in principle, use these types of models maybe at resolutions of 100 meters, say, if the global model has a resolution of 1 to 3 kilometers. But we don't want to run them just over a day. We want to run them over the full medium range. We want this to be informing, you know, these types of decisions on taking early warning and so on. So we've got to run these 50-member ensembles with at least 50-member limited area models. I mean, arguably, you might even want to, you know, cascade, if you like, the ensemble size when you get down to these even smaller scales. So 50 really is the minimal. And I just don't see this happening. As much of the limited area model is very fragmented. And the idea of developing countries running ensembles of limited area models just seems to me very implausible indeed. And in addition to that, as I say, we do need this reforecast data to properly assess skill at the postcode scale. So is there an alternative? And I think increasingly there is an alternative, and that's the use of artificial intelligence. So this is just an example of, you know, I could have chosen any number of these things, but this is an example of a technique called generative adversarial networks, where they're actually taking data on a coarse scale and doing a kind of stochastic downscaling onto small scales. An example, this is actually done over Switzerland. The example is in the figure, where the middle figure is the kind of coarse grained data. The left-hand one is a precipitation. The left-hand one is a truth field, I think, from radar data. And the right-hand one is the fine scale reconstructed using these AI methods. So I think this is a very plausible alternative. And in fact, even today, ECMWF runs a scheme called EC Point, which is a kind of a very simple type of AI scheme for downscaling ensembles. And the authors have already shown it's competitive with LAMs and limited area models. And then the great advantage, as I say, is that these can be run over the reforecast period as well. They can be coupled into the impact models. And I think the prospects for providing, both reliable and trustworthy products are much greater. And this, of course, is crucially important for some of these, for example, forecast-based financing initiatives for developing countries. So this is a viewpoint I have, that AI is going to be a major aspect of numerical weather prediction when we come to 2030. Oh, and this is just making the point that already, that Google and others are claiming that they can outperform the sort of nowcast aspects of limited area models with AI, which I don't know whether they can outperform, but certainly they're very competitive. You could actually even think, well, could AI replace medium range numerical weather prediction? That I think is extremely unlikely. We're at the stage with numerical weather prediction where we can make good forecasts, 7 to 10 days ahead. But that depends crucially on beating down the initial errors to quite small values. And if you ask the question, how many years of data would we need so that we could find analogs that agreed to within the current observational error bars? The number would be astronomical, would be something like 10 to the 30 years, almost infinitely greater than the amount of data we have at the moment. And there's a related issue, which is a little bit technical, but if you want to improve an NWP system, you can study what are called adjoint sensitivity vectors, and they tell you what part of the initial conditions to improve to get a yet better NWP system. And these adjoint vectors are very much focused on very small scales in the analysis. And these small scales, by definition, are way, 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 way down the spectrum in terms of empirical orthogonal functions. And that means that data-driven methods are going to be and they're very flow dependent as well, these small scales. It means that data-driven methods are going to have a very tough job in being able to reduce the error in these sensitivity vector directions. So for this reason, I would almost bet my house on the fact that NWP will be done in the medium range with the laws of physics, but AI can definitely play a major role in calibrating and in downscaling the global ensembles. And I hope that in a way is the way things develop. I know there's a great deal of discussion about these public-private partnerships. Clearly, companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon and all these others have a lot of AI experience, and I think we should be tapping into that for this downscaling calibration work. I have to say, on the other hand, I'm much less enthusiastic about some of the recent NWP initiatives that are coming out of the private sector, precisely for the reasons I've talked about. They're not going to be able to replicate the development of 50 or even 100 member 1 to 3 kilometer global ensembles on a regular basis. And I think that's going to be the bedrock of NWP in 2030. And I think these private NWP initiatives are a little bit peripheral to that major focus. Clearly, there's a lot of private public partnership in observations. And of course, I don't want to downplay the importance of observations, but I just want to repeat my view that our inability to assimilate observations is actually as much an obstacle, if not more of an obstacle, as having insufficient observations for improving forecast skill. Clearly, the private sector is vital in computing. I think there's a great dialogue for a partnership here. And one of the things in particular that I'm very keen on is the idea that we should somehow be using the notion of uncertainty and stochasticity and ensemble ideas, even in the design of high performance computing, because these days the energy costs of computing is the thing that constrains computers. It's not so much the amount of computations you can do. And trying to make the point that we don't need 64-bit precision. We don't really even need determinism, actually, in our production runs, because we have stochasticity in the code anyway. So if we can make chips cheaper by running them stochastically at low energy, that could be a great benefit for NWP. And so I think some dialogues and partnerships on computing can be valuable. Well, I am kind of concerned that you know, I don't want to think of NWP development as somehow only going ahead in the very developed countries, and somehow developing countries are just kind of using what's created. And I think there's enormous need for enhanced scientific collaboration between developing country and developed country scientists to improve NWP. I'm always impressed when I go to ICTP, the International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste, and I wonder whether we need an organization like that, but specifically focused on weather climate research to help bridge the gap between the scientists in these two regions. Yeah, I want to make the point that we should think about NWP going forward as part of the climate adaptation program. And in fact, this was a report by the Global Commission on Adaptation that actually put strengthening early warning systems as having the biggest benefit in terms of climate adaptation of all the possible actions that can be taken in terms of its benefit cost ratio. With a benefit cost ratio of up to 10 to 1 in terms of strengthening early warning systems. So we should think about this as part of the program to make society more resilient to the changing extremes of climate, which are happening each day that continues. So personally, I would suggest that, you know, it would be great to make a big initiative in COP26 in, for example, ensuring that all the forecast data is provided free of charge to developing countries, the full ensemble data, not just from restricted data, and that we actually invest in AI-based downscaling and calibration as part of the climate adaptation program, so that ensemble data really becomes usable by developing countries and by the aid agencies and so on. So that's something that could make a big splash at COP26, and I think this is something we should think about. So I think this is my last slide. In some sense, I'm arguing that the mandate for National Met Services in 2030 is not really to make forecasts. The forecasts should be done at these very continental scale centers doing the global ensemble forecasting. And the issue really will be downscaling to the specific local needs and using local observations. This is actually where local observations could have much greater impact than actually feeding them into the global data assimilation system, in actually doing the calibration at these very, very specific site-specific regions for specific national needs. So, you know, I'd like to see the AI being developed through global collaboration, but the particular implementation would be a National Met Service one. And similarly, I'm not sure forecasters need to forecast anymore in 2030. And I think their main job should more be interacting with customers and users, so that the decision processes which these users have to have or need to make can be guided by the most relevant probabilistic forecast products. You know, in particular, you know, if a I don't know, a regional city mayor needs to decide about evacuating a city in the face of a tropical cyclone or a hurricane, there should be a prior discussion about the probability threshold above which evacuation would take place. Could be 70%, 80%, whatever it is, based on some category of hurricane. And then when the actual event comes, the decision has almost been made because the situation has been discussed. So I think this is the kind of crucial interaction that will need to take place. And this is where forecasters, or at least what we call today forecasters, will play the most crucial role. So I think I've pretty much gone through my slides. I don't know exactly how much time I've taken because we started a little bit late, but that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, team, for your presentation. Very rich, I would say, even for those who, like myself, don't quite understand some of the terminology, but the conclusions are quite exciting to me, being part of development agenda person supporting NMHS. Before passing the floor to the panelist, please, participants, dear participants, look at your screen, and that's about the questions. As we mentioned in the beginning, you can use that slider.com to start passing the questions to team and the following presentation. So it's clear. If there will be some problem, just pass a question through this WebEx, and we will try to get back to you. With that, let me pass the floor to Alan Thorpe, who is our colleague and well-known scientist. Alan has for many years been a professor of meteorology at the University of Reading. He was the director of Hadley Center for Climate Prediction and Research, and then a chief executive of the UK's Environmental Science Funding Agency. Then from 2011 to 2015, Alan was Director General of ECMWF, and now he's providing support to many institutions, including the World Bank, WMO, and many others. With that, Alan, the floor is yours, please.
Tim, for a great insight into what NWP could and I think should be like in 2030. So I very much appreciate that perspective and agree with much of it. What I wanted to do in my few remarks is just to say a little bit about how we might deliver that vision. I just want to go back a few years to a paper that a few of us wrote in Nature in 2015 called The Quiet Revolution in NWP, which tried to summarize the state of play in NWP at that time. And we sort of boiled it down to these four areas: the better description of the initial state, adding in various components of the Earth system to make a more complete model. Obviously, the probabilistic and ensemble being a fundamental part of forecasting, and the scalability aspects, which are very much to do with the supercomputing and the ability of the codes to run efficiently. And I think what Tim has said and what I heard was that very much the 2030 vision is going to build on these components. And I think the only thing I would personally emphasize, maybe slightly more than Tim, would be that I think the initial state is going to continue to be really important. And for that, not only is it better data assimilation, but also I think when we get down to resolutions of a few kilometers, even down to 1 kilometer, we're going to need a lot more observations than we have today. So I think the observations are still a very limiting factor to define more accurately the initial state. And I'm sure Lars Peter is going to say more about those in a moment. And of course, data assimilation, it's easy to say, but it's very difficult to do. And particularly with the Earth system components, a coupled data assimilation is going to be very scientifically challenging. So although this slide looks deceptively simple, each of these areas still has a lot of science and technology developments for us to fulfill Tim's 2030 vision. Okay, go on to the next slide, please. I think we can ask the question, how are we going to deliver this vision? It's really the global weather enterprise that's going to do this. And this is really, all the components of the public sector, the National Meteorological Services, the academic sector, the universities and research institutes, and the private sector companies. And one of the purposes of showing this slide is to remind us that actually, even up to now, all of these three sectors have been working very strongly in the global weather enterprise to enable us to deliver the NWP. And sometimes, particularly if we're with one or other of these sectors, maybe we don't always recognize fully the contribution from the other sectors. And in the ellipses on this diagram, I've noted also that, of course, we need not only these people and organizations, but we also need funding to do this, to deliver. And we know we require government funding, which is really taxpayers paying for that funding. We need private capital. We need development agencies and banks like the World Bank to be able to provide the financial resources for this. But also, and importantly, we need to have a well-structured market in which the global weather enterprise can deliver the NWP. And this market has to have the right incentives and regulations to enable not only the data to be produced, but also to get it to the people who need it the most. So this ellipse that says markets and regulations, I think is really important. I'll go on to my third slide, please. So in thinking about how to deliver the vision, we know there are quite a lot of challenges to be able to do that. And a couple of years ago, David Rogers and I wrote a sort of mini essay in the Bulletin, the American Meteorological Society, on some of the challenges to deliver this kind of vision. And on this slide, I tried to summarize some of those, not all of them. Obviously, we need to mobilize resources to do this. And that's to get that higher resolution. And we also need to deliver the data to those who need it. The resources we're talking about are very multifaceted. We're not just talking about people and money. We're talking about the computing, the science, and stuff like that, delivered to those who need it. Sorry, my phone's ringing in the background. I apologize for that. I wanted to say on this slide that actually this is another area of slight disagreement with Tim. I feel that regional NWP still has a future, not least because we do need to have a test bed for very high resolution predictions to form, the next generation of global models, because we won't be satisfied with 1 or 3 kilometers global into the future. So the regional models are a good bridge between our process understanding of atmospheric processes and the operational predictions. So I still see a role for regional NWP, but I really strongly agree with Tim that in many ways the regional effort is not well organized, and if we're really going to do that, we need to improve that. I do think we need to satisfy the increasing need for more observations, and I think there's good news here because there's been quite a revolution of its own in terms of observations, because the miniaturization of instruments to measure the atmosphere, particularly those instruments that go into space, has been a major development. And on the bottom right here is a photograph of what's called a CubeSat, which is a very small satellite that enables many of the observations that used to require much bigger and more expensive satellites to be done much more effectively and efficiently. I think there is the potential for satisfying the need for more observations. And I think there is innovation in this area, which is really very important. And then finally, in terms of the challenges, although one could go on for a long time about these, I think one has to note that there has been a tremendous growth in the capability of the private sector to contribute, not just in the areas that perhaps we're traditionally used to, which is making instruments or making computers for use, but also actually right across the value chain. So increasingly, the private sector is involved in, Tim mentioned this, in being able to run numerical weather prediction models themselves, but also, of course, in the value-added user-derived products at the end of the value chain. And that's at a time when the National Meteorological Services are under great funding pressures. So these two are very important pressures on or developments in the global weather enterprise that is going to shape how we deliver the NWP vision that Tim mentioned. I could go on to my final slide, please. And I guess the one thing that also is a challenge, but I think is going to unlock the ability to answer these challenges, is that we need to have a much improved cross-sectoral cooperation between the public, private, and academic sectors. After all, no one country or organization can do this job on its own. It's a global problem. Local weather depends on global interactions, and all of the organizations and people involved benefit from being able to cooperate and not compete. And I think that's has been an area where we have tended to have perhaps less cooperation than would be optimal, and perhaps more competition between the sectors. I think, of course, also it is really important that the data, that is data from research, from modeling, observations, and from weather predictions, we maximize the value of those data if we can share them as widely as possible. And it's often stated that we want to have open data, we want to share them as widely as possible. And of course, I agree with that. But it's easy to say and much less easy to do. And I think that's because we have to understand that all of the sectors operate in somewhat different ways. And what we need is a comprehensive, if you like, business model that enables all the sectors to be supported. And so that eventually all data like this can be shared. But it's not a straightforward matter. And I think it's something we need to work together on to enable this to happen. And in many respects, we need to build trust between the sectors. And just to give an example, we need all the sectors to be able to feel they have a voice in determining how the global weather enterprise goes forward. So the World Meteorological Organization has done a fantastic job bringing together the national meteorological services, and I hope that and long for the day when that can be extended to incorporate all of the sectors of the weather enterprise. And I know that WMO is very keen to do this, and I really support them in doing that. And then a final point I want to make before finishing is that we often think about the public investment side. We need funds to come from governments to be able to keep the public investment side going. And that acts as a very vital stimulus for the global weather enterprise, but it really isn't enough on its own. If you look at the contribution from the different sectors, the private sector in terms of financial input represents a really huge fraction of the investment that goes into the global weather enterprise. And actually, many governments understand that the role of public investment is very much to act as a stimulus, and not only to generate public value goods, but also to stimulate the private sector. And I think that's a very virtuous circle if you can get that right. So I think I'll stop there, but I wanted just to say a few things about how I see we can deliver the vision that Tim has so eloquently described to us. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Thanks very much, Alan. Very clear. We're kind of moving towards actions from a big vision, which was eloquently described by him. You can see on the screen again this question. So if you want to pose questions, please do so. And with that, now I'm passing the floor to Lars Peter Riishojgaard, another discussant, and Dr. Lars Peter, Lars is director of the Earth System branch in the WMO Secretariat, with responsibility for the operational aspects of all numerical modeling activities and for the marine, hydrologic, cryosphere components of the WMO Vigus system. Lars, floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. So, in a sense, Tim threw a couple of challenges at WMO. And just at a high level, what is WMO's role in global NWP? There are three main aspects of it. We coordinate the access to observations, especially for the conventional observations. Only WMO is really the only organization that has the reach and the authority to coordinate this. And I'll get back to that in a second. we coordinate the exchange of analysis and forecast fields upon which much of the progress of NWP is built, actually, via the GDPFS. I won't say too much about the GDPFS in these short remarks. I will say a little bit about the coordination, or perhaps the lack of coordination of downstream activities, because I think that was really central to the points that were made by both Alan and Tim. So on to the next slide. I am probably more on the side of Alan in terms of, I think the access to observations is absolutely vital. And it's important to note that on the conventional side, we are not really progressing. We are exchanging basically the same number of conventional observations that we did in 1995 when Resolution 40 was adopted. And in the meantime, the resolution of the NWP system has grown by a factor of probably 10,000 or more, depending on how you calculate it. We all know that we need to exchange observations. The WMO Convention says so. WMO was actually established as an organization primarily to facilitate that. It says so in the Paris Agreement. Click and a text box will appear. One of the problems that we are struggling with is that we assume that the responsibility to provide observations is a purely national matter. In some parts of the world, we know that this isn't working, and it probably never will. And I will emphasize that I speak about conventional observations here. Satellite data are vitally important, but they cannot do this alone. There are a couple of variables that we only or primarily measure from the surface at this point. The next slide will show you what we are actually doing today in terms of observational data exchange. This is a snapshot of the exchange of surface pressure observations. Green is good. It's reliable reporting with a good temporal resolution. Anything that is not green is suboptimal. So we are not doing as well as we should, and this is a real problem. This is actually a limiting factor in the quality of the NWP output, and this is something for which WMO and its member NMHSs are responsible. So we are trying to tackle this problem. I'm emphasizing this not just because I want to keep harping on observations, but also because it's symptomatic of the way WMO is thinking about its global coordination responsibility in this period. Let's go on to the next slide. There's a long litany of reasons for why we are falling short in terms of data exchange. So a lot of this has to do with maybe WMO not being particularly clear in its regulatory material. But click one time for me, and then you'll see a list of primary reasons for this. Some things have to do with data policy. Some reasons have to do with the lack of technical capability, lack of financial resources in many parts of the world. That will come as a surprise to nobody. And it's important also to recognize that the conventional observing systems don't have a strong satellite lobby behind them that is able to invest in improving the impact of them. And in data assimilation, to some extent, you get the impact out of what you invest in. So that's an important, up to a certain limit, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. Next slide. So WMO has adopted the Global Basic Observing System, which will take, hopefully, the map of the world in terms of data exchange from this look to the green look that you will see if you click on this slide. How do we do that? You will see that if you click one more time. The WMO is drafting regulatory material that will specify in unequivocal terms what the members are obligated to exchange in terms of horizontal. It will require money in the developing world. It comes at a cost, and we are working closely with 30 different institutions in the development and climate financing world. our host today, the World Bank, is one of them, to establish a systematic observations facility that will help pay for the implementation and the running of GBON in parts of the world where there is just not enough local resources to do that. Click one more time and a yellow box will appear that gives you a first guess at what this would cost, what it costs to turn the map green and fill it in with points. We're talking about a capital investment of about $350 million and annual operating costs of $150 million, above and beyond what we do today. Put this in the perspective of what we pay for the global observing system. It's a lot of money, but it's not completely out of the realm of the reasonable. So that's what we're doing. Move on to the next slide. So downstream coordination activities. Both Alan and Tim mentioned this idea of do we or do we not need regional NWP systems? And the interesting thing, if you work for WMO, is that it doesn't actually matter what you think or what you say about it. The developing countries are very used to hearing from the developed members, do not bother with your own NWP capabilities. You're never going to be able to make a contribution anywhere. It irritates them and it doesn't resonate with them for a number of reasons. Some has to do with national sovereignty and security and the concern about guaranteed open access to NWP output. Most WMO members are very attuned also to the idea that especially seasonal outlook can have enormous economic impacts via commodity trading and speculation. They're very attuned to the fact that reanalysis is used to drive climate policy, and they want to have a seat at the table, and they want to have insight into what is actually driving the climate agenda. It's not driven by pure observations that anybody can make. It's driven to a large extent by reanalysis. And ECMWF, as most of us know, they're the gold standard on that. And it is not viable to have that as a black box. They want insight into what's going on there. There's also a sense in many developing countries that when you do capacity development of your Met service, having your own NWP capability is a key milestone. So the question I think that Tim is asking perhaps is, could we set up a global coordinated system that would be economically efficient and guarantee access to NWP output, address some of these sensitivities that are listed above, and above all, avoid contributing to further widening the technology gap between the haves and the have-nots? Perhaps yes, but it would require much closer collaboration and a much stronger coordinating hand than we are used to seeing in WMO, where we are infallibly polite and tend to rely on volunteerism to a very large extent. So the GBON example that I just showed you and the SOF is perhaps a model for a bit stronger coordination role that I think WMO ought to play in order to get this to work. And I think the next slide is the final one. A little bit about the role of the NMHS in the future. It's a turbulent time for the NMHSs, especially in the developing world, but not only for them. Some of them have only, if we're frank, only have marginal capabilities, and they are under dual pressure from the private sector that are sort of muscling in on their turf, if you will, and from their own governments who are looking at the private sector and say, hey, why am I paying to have a Met service? I have companies calling me every day offering me money to take this over. And I agree with Tim, sort of regardless of who actually does this, whether it's an NMHS or private sector entity or third. You don't really do forecasting, or you won't do forecasting in 10 years the way that many do it today. There will relevant local expertise will be needed in order to translate the output into local conditions and actually to help improve the output down the road. But I think the most important thing is the interaction with decision makers and the ability to understand the local vulnerabilities vulnerabilities, because it's not just about understanding the forecast, it's also about understanding what does the forecast mean in this particular local area with the demographics and the economics and the structures that prevail there. So I think I basically agree with much of what Tim said on this. I think the final, that was my final slides. I think I've pretty much said everything already that's listed on this. I do think that WMO could play an important role as a global coordinator, similar to what we've done with GDPFS in the past, where we coordinated the exchange of NWP and analysis field and coordinated the development of metrics for skill, and were instrumental in sort of lifting the whole NWP up to its current state of the art, where it's at a bit of a watershed moment, and something big needs to happen. And I think Tim laid out very nicely what might happen, but it does require a level of global coordination in order to be efficient and effective. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Thanks, Lars. Again, colleagues, you can see on your screen how you can pose questions. So far, we have more than a dozen. And now it's time to move to the last panelist, which is our colleague Alice Soares. And Alice, in many places, she provides expert assistance and advice on weather, climate, and water-related issues to the World Bank, as I mentioned, WMO, French Agency for Development, government, several countries, as well as other organizations. Alice, please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Vladimir. I'll talk about what we feel when we arrive at the national level and what the bank is trying to do to try to deliver the vision that Tim is talking about, and Alan and Lars also mentioned, what we can do from the bank's perspective with the modernization programs. When we arrive at the national level, typically NWP issues nowadays are limited use of global and regional NWP, also limited understanding of ensembles and the EPS products. They tend to run low resolution deterministic NWP, most of the models around 15 to 30 kilometers resolution, with no data assimilation nor optimal parameterizations. There is no objective verification, no post-processing, but even though there is few NWP and ICT staff, we will find very talented staff in most of these countries. Of course, this is a generic statement, and we have cases of success where there is investment through World Bank and other development partners projects where they can reach a level of a center that may become a regional center. I can give you an example of Vietnam, where the bank and other development partners provided a number of support, and at the moment they are able to serve as a regional forecast support center within the WMO umbrella of the GDPFS and provide NWP products and guidance to the neighboring countries. So there are cases of success, but in general terms, the typical approach that we find in most of these developing countries is those items that I have listed. Next slide, please. Current hydromet modernization. When we face this, when we try to develop projects in these countries, the usual requests from the World Bank clients are we want an HPC to run. I have already heard from some of the countries we want to run a global model, but there are ways of convincing them that this is not affordable, not sustainable, and so on. But still, there are requests like that. In terms of building the capacity, they tend to ask to build the capacity to run a deterministic NWP at higher resolution, 3 to 7 kilometers, with data assimilation. This is the reality when we arrive on the ground, is what they ask. Typical results that we have based on these requests and some of the investments are some experiments. We build a little bit of the capacity, but there is no operational capacity due to the limited number of staff. As I mentioned, they are limited, but they tend to be talent. Next slide, please. One of the questions that we can have at the moment is why to keep the current investments? Are these current investments waste? In fact, in my own opinion, these current investments are important. They are important first to create a pool of experts, to build the capacity. Also, most of this equipment that is provided nowadays and in the past few years, there is a short life cycle, and these need to be replaced at a certain stage. But at the same time, we are working on a strategy for them to migrate from deterministic to probabilistic solutions, replacing the national limited area model, eventually with artificial intelligence based on scaling and calibration in the future. But we can't expect overnight changes in most of these countries. So we need the transition path. Next slide, please. So we see that the hydromet portfolio in the last 10 years from the bank is growing, and in particular in the South Asia region. So the click, please. Doesn't appear correctly, the map. The map was supposed to just show the South Asia region, and we have in the call the leads of these developments, like Arati and Devi are working on this issue, and I would like to emphasize that in the South Asia region, there are many projects from the bank, hydromet projects, and also technical assistance. So it's a good region to start initiating this transitional path. So next slide, please. So how we are seeing that? We are seeing as a regional modeling platform where we have NMHS modelers, those that have the talent, the universities in the region to cooperate on the model development and model calibration, moving from full ensemble systems to artificial intelligence in the future. But as Alan and also Lars Peters mentioned, having a regional approach here, we would expect to have regional ensembles at a certain stage, and using all of the talent people working together in this initiative. And this would give them the ownership. That's an important aspect that Lars pointed out. We have at the national level the issue of being proud of having NWP, so also to show to the government that they have that capacity, and the ownership aspect is very important. So by having all these talent people working together at the regional level would be a way of sorting out the two aspects. Working at the regional level through a regional modeling platform, we will have a continuous development, improvement and sharing expertise, and would become sustainable. That's one of the important aspects that we would like to see after the project ends, that is sustainable for the future. Next slide, please. In terms of governance, so this is being piloted or initiated in South Asia region, where we will have the RIMES Council with all the permanent representatives. Most of them are director generals of the NMHSs of Africa and Asia, and then having a committee, a subcommittee of that council, with all the director generals of South Asia, plus Myanmar, because Myanmar in the bank side is not part of South Asia, but from the weather perspective, it makes sense to include it. So it also includes Myanmar in the group. And then under this group of directors, having a South Asia working group on numerical weather prediction, where we bring all the modelers and universities of all South Asia countries and Myanmar, and representatives from global centers, plus the RIMES Operation Center, to work together in developing this regional capacity, rather than having it at the national level. Next slide, please. Fundamentals about this issue, and I would start from the last point. The last point is changing mindsets at the national level. This is critical because when we arrive there, most of the issues are really related to the fact that they want to have their own capacity. And while through the World Bank projects, we are facilitating most of these countries to have access to the ECMWF full data sets, even though that there is an issue of mindset, and they have limited use of all this data that we facilitate them to get access. So there is an alignment of organizational change with the technology innovation that needs to be in place in most of these organizations. And when I'm talking about organizational change, is really to make the changes inside of the organization so that we have people dedicated to the right aspects, rather than having them distributed through all aspects of the value chain. Also, in most of the projects, we are trying to shift focus from the capital-based infrastructure to the service-oriented approach, still keeping the support for the observing network. And in relation to the critical national observations that we try to support through the projects, one of the issues that we always tend to support and emphasize in these projects is the need to share this data on the global telecommunication system, the WMO information system. And one issue that I didn't mention before, but we also face, is that sometimes the countries or the NMHSs believe that they are sharing the data, but due to any technical problem, it's not shared. So there are many aspects here in relation to not sharing the observations. There is the political aspect that they want to keep most of them. There is the aspect related to technical problems, and that all need to be addressed. So, but one of the issues that we always try to bring is all the investments that are done through the World Bank projects in observations, is to make them available for the global community. In aspects related to the global and regional models, one of the issues, and I mentioned before, we always try to bring the ECMWF license agreements to these countries. So making them use the global and regional models rather than develop their own national limited area model. That's some aspects that we also bring to these projects. And throughout these 10 years that we are talking about in relation to deliver the vision that Tim talks about, through these investments in the transitional path, we will be replacing deterministic modeling with ensemble prediction systems, mostly or basically at the regional level, and then more at the national level, replacing the national LAM with artificial intelligence-based downscaling and calibration. But I would say that this doesn't change from one day to the other, and we need to take time to go through this process. So thank you.
Yes, we have plenty of questions and not that much time. I hope we can stay, most of us, let's say 10 more minutes, and we have 20 minutes plus for the questions. Let me start with one question which we received during previous presentation, which came from Louis Uccellini, whom many of us know, and that is about something which is very important. Actually, something why we're having this virtual event rather than seeing together somewhere. It's about COVID, and that was, well, with COVID, how that transition to this vision 2030 will be unfolding. For instance, Louis asked what is ability of have and have-nots, how to contribute what is needed. Alan already responded through correspondence. Team, Lars, any quick thoughts about what COVID, how COVID may have impact on your vision?
One point I would like to make, I mean, clearly COVID is a big negative in many respects, but I think the one positive thing, let's say, we can take from it is that it's forcing us to think about, you know, the future in a completely different way than maybe we thought about it, you know, last year. It's forcing us to reevaluate all of our priorities. You know, how much do I travel in the future? Can I actually do a lot of my communication in this sort of way, lead perhaps a life with a lower carbon footprint? But I think we could, if we could take a positive out of it, that it's kind of forcing us all to think, you know, about the future again in a fresh, you know, almost sort of starting from scratch. So in some ways this could be beneficial if we're trying to think about a vision for 2030 that does involve some radical rethinks. Maybe COVID could be a good thing from that point of view. I'm just trying to extract something positive from something which is obviously mainly very negative.
Lars, would you like to say a few words, or you're fine?
Yeah, what we're seeing in COVID in terms of just the operations as we monitor them today is that it affects the poor country much more drastically than the wealthy country. What will happen down the road, I kind of share Alan's worry that this could be really bad. It could be bad for many players. We've lost most of the aircraft observations. We don't know if and when they will come back. I think some countries will have difficulty providing any level of funding to the Met services. I think it could be really bad for our sector for quite a while, actually.
Thanks, Lars. Okay, colleagues, I'm seeing a number of questions, and I will start with the ones with a big support. The top one was 5 supporting notions, and that question is anonymous, and it's the question is: given that so much of the available NWP forecast info is underutilized, how can we ensure a COP investment does not only improve skill but also use? Again, if I can ask all participants who wants to respond to that, please start. Let's start again from the other end. Alice, do you know what to say? Okay, I see it. Alice, if you don't ready, I can pass to somebody else. I see you on the screen, actually.
Yeah. No, I can make a comment. It's basically what I was saying during my talk. We need to have someone on the ground to help them going through the process, and coaching and mentoring is required to make sure that the NWP products that are available globally are used really at the national level. And as an international advisor to Myanmar, for example, and I spend a lot of time in country and spending a lot of time during shift work to make sure that they make this transition. And I have colleagues in other countries like Gerald in Sri Lanka, Hali in Bangladesh, making sure that this happens. It's not just signing an agreement for investment that the issues are sorted out. Are issues at the national level, on the ground, going through the process with forecasters to make sure that the issues change. That is basically based on my experience in most of these countries. Thank you.
Because you made that point about COP investment, do you have an answer how to improve the use of this future improved forecast?
Well, look, I suggest that you talk to people that do use forecasts. I mean, I'm somebody, I wouldn't call myself. I mean, I've worked a lot at ECMWF trying to improve the forecasts and develop ensemble systems, but I wouldn't really call myself somebody that engages with society in using forecasts. So, I've been enormously impressed by the vision and the technical knowledge of organizations like the Climate Red Cross, the Red Crescent Climate Center. These are people that are really trying to, change the way in which the information from numerical weather prediction is really used to benefit society. So I would ask them that question. How can, what is needed for them, for the climate center, the Red Crescent Climate Center, to make better use of NWP for the benefit of society? These are the people that you should be bringing into this discussion, because I think they can really contribute massively to this whole debate.
Thanks. Anybody from the panel, any few words?
Yes, Vladimir, I would like to say something. I think this is a really important question and a really important issue about how to share data, actually, and share the forecast data. And it's, all parts of the global weather enterprise has a problem, in a sense, with this, because, there are famous international weather centers that produce NWP forecasts, but which sell the data from the public sector. And there are private companies on the other end of the spectrum at the moment during the COVID situation that are providing their data for free during a national emergency. So it comes back for me to the point I was trying to make, which is that we need a sort of quotes unquote business model that enables this sharing of forecast information to be much more pervasive than it is today. But it's not something that somehow an individual organization can deal with. It's something that collectively we need to consider, because the different sectors that contribute this information operate in different ways. So a one-size-fits-all is not going to work, but we do need to solve this problem, because, as we know, there are many people who don't have access to the information that will get them out of harm's way, and that's something that is a real failing of our community at the moment.
Thanks, Alan. Another high-ranking question came from Darine Igorski. Sorry if I mispronounced the last name. The question is, when thinking about one model per continent, how are ocean areas envisaged in that scale? Thinking global impacts there and safety of life at sea. Tim, you're the first one to respond to that, definitely.
Yeah. No, I mean, perhaps this has been slightly misunderstood. I'm not claiming somehow a model just focuses on a continental domain. I'm asking the question: how many global models do we need in the world? I mean, there's nothing wrong with having an infinite number of global models if there are an infinite number of resources, but we have finite resources, and the question is, given the finite resources, how many global models can we afford? So the global models clearly will incorporate all the sea points and so on. So they will be forecasting over the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Southern Ocean, because they're global models. But my point is that I think the way we divide the resources that we have currently and this, I mean, this is even worse in the climate field, where there are so many of these climate models, which really, I think, contribute very little to our overall knowledge. My own view is that, we do need some rationalization of global modeling. I'm certainly not kind of claiming that one global model will do everything. We need some competition. But, if we had one in North America, had one in North America, one in South America, one in Europe, one in Asia, maybe one in Africa, I mean, that would be about the right number, I think. And, and then the resources should be pooled nationally and internationally to create the very best global models that we have. And as I say, we can use stochasticity to represent model uncertainty, so we don't need large numbers of multi-model ensembles.
Thanks, Tim. Any panelists, or shall we pass another question? Okay, let me select another one which is high ranking, and that is from Erin Leperes, if again I pronounced it properly. The question is, if regional NWP has a future, how can we ensure it is equitable? Right now, regional NWP happens predominantly in wealthy part of the world. Maybe we'll start with Alan this time, and then Tim, if you can think something about that, and then Lars.
Well, from my point of view, the answer to this, as is true actually for other areas as well, and that is there has to be a regional cooperation to enable it to happen. So if I could just quote Europe, which I know more about, Europe has a number, actually more than one, but several regional modeling NWP consortia that links different countries together for a common goal. And of course, ECMWF is a good example of many of the European countries coming together for global prediction. But in the regional space, it happens in Europe, but perhaps not pervasively enough. And for example, RIMES in Asia is a regional center that draws together the resources of different countries, which can be focused on both, the use of global information as well as regional prediction.
Something that Alan said, I do think that regional modeling has a future, precisely for the reason that he said. It's a testbed for developing yet higher resolution global models. So I'm absolutely not saying that regional modeling doesn't have a future. It has a future both in academia and in operational centers. Where I don't think my own view anyway, is that I don't think it has a future in operational numerical weather prediction. And, if we say Europe is a good example of what happens, I think things don't happen at all well in Europe. For a long time, I've tried to argue, why aren't the various European consortia getting together, running their regional models over a common European domain and creating ensembles of 50 or more members, out to day 10 to run alongside the ECMWF ensemble. And it seems, for various political, national reasons, I don't know, that seems almost impossible to organize. Never mind all the reforecasting that has to happen. So if it's so difficult in Europe, it's almost inconceivable that this is going to happen in the developing parts of the world. So my own view is that we have to think of alternative ways. And I think with the recent growth of AI, this provides some wonderful opportunities, which will be certainly competitive and potentially even outperform what regional NWP can do. Hello?
Amir, I think your microphone is muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's about AA question. Question is, do you think that AA based downscaling would possibly predict the 15 sigma event as witnessed in Kerala?
I guess that question's aimed at me since I mentioned it.
Yes, indeed.
It's a great question, but based, and I don't know the answer to the question because I don't know, but AI has as I say, even as we speak, there is a system which has become operational at ECMWF called EC Point, and it's a way literally of going downscaling. It's certainly not full AI by any means, because it doesn't take account of the local topography within a grid point, but there's a lot of AI type of ideas in it, and it has shown unquestionably to improve the tails of distributions of heavy rainfall. I don't know about 15 sigma, but certainly out to many, many sigma that the raw ensemble cannot produce. And in fact, the very question has just put in my mind, I will email the author of EC Point to actually ask him if he can run EC Point on the 2018 Kerala floods, because that would be a very interesting question. My guess is it probably won't do 15 sigma, but it'll do a damn sight better than the raw ensemble can.
Thanks. Another question, and I hope we're approaching the end, because there are some 15 more, but I don't think we can handle all. The question, which is still was high ranking, is who would own, question marks, this global and regional model system? This could be a potential for a power play, again, in quotation marks, like the race for space if we aren't careful. Lars, maybe you can start with that.
Yeah, this was actually kind of what I was alluding to, what I mentioned, why so many of the developing countries are keen on establishing some form of own proper national NWP effort. They are very attuned to the fact that these systems, both on a weather time scale and for climate reanalysis, have enormous economic impact, and they're being made to drive a very wide-ranging decision. So of course there's sensitivity to who owns it, and they will need to be publicly owned in some form or fashion. And I think this also goes to this issue that Tim was mentioning. Why are there three separate NWP consortia in Europe? It doesn't make sense, but it is because of it requires a level of trust that just isn't quite there to give up on having your own capability. I don't have a real good answer to the question, but the sensitivities are very clear, and we have to address them in order to make any real progress there. Otherwise, we will be in this boat for a long time that Tim was describing.
Another thing worth saying on this is that, of course, in many respects, if we can make modeling systems available to whoever wants to use them, they become much more powerful. So, for example, in the United States, the modeling system is available to organizations to use. And so, in a sense, they're not proprietary, these modeling systems. And the more people who can use them, the more feedback the National Weather Center, the National Weather Service, etc., gets from the use of their system. And ECMWF has an open IFS initiative to make its code and system available for others to use. So I think that's quite an interesting model to think about, rather than a race, a power play between these systems.
Yeah, if I could just come in just to say I completely agree with what Alan said, and I would love it that scientists from I don't know, Bangladesh or Kenya or something would really be contributing to the development of parameterizations of clouds or cloud microphysics, or some new sort of time stepping scheme. And if they have available the code for doing research through something like OpenIFS, then this can be achieved. So it has to be something where scientists around the world can contribute their expertise, and then everyone will feel some kind of ownership.
Yeah, if I just may add something. This is basically the idea of having this regional platform in South Asia, is bringing those that have the talent to work on development in the models if the codes are available. So by bringing those that can work together on this issue. So it's aligned with what Alan and Tim were saying.
Exactly. I wanted to say the same. Thanks, Alice. And we have significant large operations in this region. And the new one, the big one, will come in Pakistan, which is a big country with huge needs. So if something can be done there, including to Bangladesh and other countries, and Nepal, etc. But there is a direct question to Alan. It comes from Mr. Trocoli, not again mispronounce the name. Alan, the private seems keen to collaborate with the public when funding is from the public. What are examples of public-private partnership with funding mainly private? That's a question.
It's a great question, Alberto. But I think the question is based on a misreading of the relationship between the public and private sector. I mean, one of the roles of public investment by governments is to enable to stimulate the private sector by that public investment. So, just for example, to give you a particular example, the Copernicus program in Europe, which provides data on a number of aspects of the natural environment, that program is funded by the public sector, and the data are available to anybody. But the expressed wish of the European Union in creating that program is for those data to stimulate the private sector, to enable companies to grow up, for jobs to be created, and for that public investment to trigger private activity. So, in a sense, the one-way flow of money from public to private is embedded in that. Of course, we want to see a flow of the utilization of the information by the private sector, and that will be helpful to the public initiative. The more that, for example, national Met services like the Met Office can see how their data is being used by the private sector to create products, the more they can use that feedback to improve the basic science and technology of numerical weather prediction. So I think there's a virtuous circle there, but it's not a straightforward one of equality, if you like, of the directions of the funding streams.
Thank you. Colleagues, I guess we exceeded our time allocation by 8 minutes, and there are still a number of questions which are not responded, and we will physically, I don't think that our participants as well as panelists and presenters will stay as long. If you don't mind, what I want to suggest, we will of course collect all these questions. We will send to the team, and we'll try to respond if you have time, of course. We also will share the slides, with your permission, colleagues, presenters and discussants. We will share with everybody on the call. So, and if there's any last minute points from the panel, whom I see on my screen, it's a time to make it. Otherwise, I think, yeah, I should also mention that overall we had over 160 people on the call today. So it's quite significant number among those who were interested. As I mentioned, they registered 200 and 160 were in the call. So that's a great interest, and I hope it's not the last one, which indeed indicates that this area of strengthening NMHS and improving delivery of weather, climate, and hydrological services for multiple reasons. And what was important to me to listen is there are a number of important things, but protecting the most vulnerable and strengthening resilience of the poor was closer to the agenda of the bank. This global events, which Tim presented at Global Vision, was very important to reach that. So I thank to everybody for very inspirational presentations, and I'm looking forward to work with you on a number of fronts. Thanks a lot.